When it comes to peep sights, there's several things that you need to keep in mind and also multiple things that you need to factor in when picking them. Now, this is one of the important things that I always have to really take a good look at when it comes to building my hybrid bow, or the bow that I'm going to be using for the bulk of my training season. Now, a lot of your peep sight choices are going to depend on what your front sight is going to look like. So if you decided, hey, I'm just going to go to lighter limbs, I might try a different stabilizer, maybe I'm trying a different arrow, but I'm still going to just shoot my 5-pin sight, then you're probably going to have to choose a larger peep, just like you would in a hunting situation. Because what we're always looking for is we're always looking for a peep size that is going to match that diameter of that front scope that you have that's out in front of you. You want to have a perfect eclipse around that front sight. So depending on how far your peep is away from your eye because of string angle, or how far forward you bring your head onto that string, as well as how far out in front of you are you putting that sight. If you're stretching that sight a lot further out in front of you, as it moves further away from you, it's going to appear smaller and smaller, which is going to force you to use a smaller and smaller peep so that you can have that perfect eclipse. Now, what you don't want is you don't want to have a bunch of extra room around that peep sight so that you have the ability for margin up, down, left, right, because that margin that I just showed you there, when I look at the peep or the front sight diameter and what your peep diameter would be, if you have the ability to be 1/2 inch off this way, 1/2 inch off that way, 1/2 inch left, 1/2 inch right, that's really no different than moving your front pin that same amount of distance, which, as you know, is going to move your arrow impact a lot. So you want to have a front sight that really pairs well with your peep. The other thing you have to factor in is, are you shooting a lens? Because if you're shooting a lens, then what you're going to find is the more power you have in that front lens, the more you're going to need to shoot a smaller peep in order to clarify that image. If you have a large peep and a high power front lens, you're going to have some distortion. It's going to look blurry, and you're going to either be forced with shooting a clarifier in the back peep or a small lens in the back peep, which personally I don't really prefer, because one little single drop of water that hits that is going to cause you issues. So I really like to decide, what am I going to shoot for my front sight, which we did in the last segment. Am I going to shoot a lens? I've decided I'm not. So at this point, I'm going to choose what peep sight will allow me to have a small enough peep sight to where, with that sight that I chose, I'm going to be able to have that perfect eclipse to where if I'm off a little bit low, all of a sudden I can't see that front scope ring. Or if all of a sudden I start to come out of my peep, I'm going to all of a sudden not be able to see the bottom of that line or my level. Now, for me personally, when it comes to looking through my peep sight and actually centering these objects, I always like to move from 6 o'clock to 3 o'clock, back to look at my pin, and back down. So when I'm checking in on my peep sight, I'm always checking in, am I good at 6? Am I good at 3? Look at my pin again, make sure I'm aiming in the right spot. If all of a sudden I do that rotation and I can see a gap on one side of that front housing, then I know that I'm changing my head position, and I'm going to change my impact point too. Now, if you're decided that you want to shoot a true target setup, which is a very small front scope, for example, when I competed, I shot a 29mm front scope. It was very small. I was able to shoot a very, very small peep sight so that when I looked through it, I had that perfect eclipse around there. Now, as a rule of thumb, The smaller your peep, the more accurate you're going to be, just because you're able to have less room of margin around that front sight. However, the smaller your peep, the less light that you're going to gather through that peep, so it gets harder to see in those dark conditions. So there is a trade-off. Now when it comes to peep position on your string, what you need to do is kind of think about what is your range when it comes to where you're shooting. Do I shoot from the top of my sight where my 20-yard mark is? Like, let's say your 20-yard pin is higher up on your sight scale, and let's say by the time you shoot 100 yards, your sight's way down here. Because you're having to look up through that peep sight to see that shorter distance, and you're having to look down to see that longer distance, it's important that you have this peep adjusted to where you're going to be the most comfortable at the distances that you're going to average or shoot as an average. So for example, when I shot competitive field, I would shoot from 20 meters to 60 meters. So let's say it covered that type of range on my front sight. So what I would do is I would always, at that point, put my sight at that 40-yard mark and go out on the range and really find a position to where I felt like my head was perfectly straight and I was very comfortable looking through that peep sight at that middle range. Now for these tack events, I know that the ranges are going to be long. They're probably going to more like be from the middle part of my scale to as far as my bottom will go. So I'm probably going to set my peep to where when I'm looking down through it towards where my 70 or 80-yard mark is, I'm going to be the most comfortable. So on my hunting setups, I normally set those up to where I'm the most comfortable at 40 yards. With my target setups or the setups I use for like these hybrid type training events or shooting in my backyard, which I prefer to shoot at 80 or 90 the most, I'm going to set my peep height to where I feel really comfortable about 70 yards. That way, if I shoot closer targets, I'm not having to tip my head down so much so that I can see those shorter yardages, and I'm also still comfortable and not having to peek down through it to get to the longer yardages. So those are things that you should keep in mind. But most important is going to be picking a peep sight that's going to match the front diameter of that new target sight or housing where you're putting it. So if you've chose a 2-pin sight and that's what you hunt with, maybe for this experiment you might want to try putting it further out so it is a little smaller and you can go to that smaller peep sight. Or maybe if you're struggling to see through that peep sight and it just seems like it's just a little bit too small, you're not gathering much light, then bring that sight back closer to you so that it looks a little bit bigger. If you follow these rules for picking your peep sight, you're going to have the one that matches your front sight perfectly.